hope everyone is having a great start of the week. Um, we're really excited this week to be joined by 200 attendees, so this should be a great presentation. Welcome to the UH Energy Electric Vehicle webinar series. Today we will be discussing EV myths, misconceptions, surprises, and perspectives, a research and personal experience-based view, and we are joined by Daniel Richmond from Green Mountain Energy. My name is Saad Maiman. I'm a student at the Bauer College of Business at the University of Houston. I'm currently majoring in MIS in Finance, and today I will be moderating today's event. Before we begin the event, I would just like to take a quick minute to thank Evolve Houston. We're so glad that they're working with us to help provide Houstonians with reliable alternatives for transportation to accelerate clean transportation through electrification. They've been working on so many projects just in the Houston area, and it will be a great resource for anyone who's interested in anything regarding EVs. To learn more about the electric vehicle webinar series and any other UH-related projects, please visit the UH Energy page, which is chat below. Moving forward, we will be at the end of the presentation, so utilizing the chat feature on the right side. So during the presentation, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we moderate any incoming in the further. I'll make sure to bring them. With ado, I would like to introduce Daniel Richmond, who is a manager of EV and solar strategy at Green Mountain Energy. He is very passionate about helping customers with solar panels on their roofs and EVs in their driveways, and has been working with EVs, renewable energy, and solar since 2011, which is when he drove his first electric car. Originally, he's from Washington, D.C. area, and he moved to Houston in 2004 to go to Rice, where he initially got into renewable energy efficiency by writing a business plan for a service company. Since then, he's gotten his MBA from Tulane University, and now he lives in Katy with his wife and two daughters. Today, he has joined us for this presentation that he has designed to go beyond the typical treatment of EVs in the mass media. For the new EV drivers, he hopes to provide different perspectives on what it's like to drive an EV, both common debates and the talking points, as well as the things that surprised him while he got into the habit of driving one. And he would like to answer any questions that you guys have. So without further ado, I would like to invite Daniel, and you can take it on from here. Perfect. We can continue.
Thank you so much, son. I just want to check that I'm coming through cleanly, smoothly. Any IT issues, anything like that? Awesome. It's weird giving one of these without being able to see everybody, but I will do my best to go through all of the material. As Saad mentioned, I'm with Green Mountain Energy, and I run their solar and EV initiatives. So we'll just dive right in because there's a lot in here. Quick agenda, my goals for today. I'm hoping to basically fire a whole bunch of information at you for about 30 or 35 minutes. This presentation came out of 10 years of talking about EVs with all sorts of different people who knew more than I did, people who knew less than I did, people who had never seen or heard of an EV at all. So there's a lot of topics, a lot of detail, and I'm happy to dive into more depth in the Q&A. Hoping to split it up about 50-50, 30-35 minutes of talking, 25-30 minutes of questions. My experience has been that there's usually a lot of questions, and I'd rather talk to you about things that you want to hear about and have specific interest in rather than just covering a whole bunch of stuff and then kind of hanging up. So my contact info, best way to get in touch with me if you want to reach out to me after is my email, daniel.richmond@greenmountain.com. And we'll dive right in. So Saad covered a little bit of this. This presentation came from reading articles about EVs in the typical mass media. I've been doing it for 10 years. It was funny when I started out, I used to get a Google alert of every EV related article that was printed across the internet. There'd be 4 or 5 a day. Several years ago, obviously, I had to stop reading all of them, but they all kind of tend to take the same tone. And we'll get into exactly what that is in a second. So I wanted to present something a little bit different, which is, as I've talked to people over the last 10 years about EVs, what made people think? What made people go, tell me more about that. I'm a little more interested in that, or I can take that and kind of change my way of thinking. One of the big ones for me actually is EV versus electric car. I'm a big fan of talking to people about electric cars. I feel like it's just a little more relatable. But I feel like I'm a bit of a lonely crusader in that EV is definitely the accepted term across the industry. So hopefully something in here sparks something you haven't thought about, something you had thought about, and I can give you some more detail on anything along those lines. Looking forward to kind of presenting it all and then chatting at the end about whatever else you want to go into. So your typical article about EVs kind of covers the same points. There's range anxiety, which is hard. Charging times are long and kind of a hassle to set up and figure out. The vehicles are expensive, but fuel is cheap and it's a lot cleaner. I've kind of taken a better tack in that. Obviously, I am a big EV advocate. The way I describe EVs to people now are they're cheaper, they're cleaner, they're more convenient, they're more fun, all of which are benefits. The downside is you do have to get used to it. Switching to an EV is a habit. It is a lifestyle change. It's sort of a paradigm change, a different way of thinking about transportation. And once you get used to it, you end up better off for it. At the end, we'll kind of go into the useful technical factoids, just random things that I've learned that didn't fit into cheaper, cleaner, more convenient, or more fun. But all the stuff that people go, oh yeah, that's an interesting detail that kind of changed the way I thought about it. So we'll dive right in. 15 slides in 30 minutes. That gives me about 2 minutes a slide. So we'll dive right in and get a couple of these. I hope you guys can read these. I'm not the greatest PowerPoint person, but I'm happy to go into it and see what we can get. The first topic I always talk about is cheaper. Whenever I talk to people, cheaper does seem to be a larger driver of EV sales than cleaner. But no one really knows how much electricity costs, how big is a kilowatt hour, how much is it going to add to my bill. There's lots of misconceptions about electricity costs more than gasoline, all sorts of things. So the most useful rule of thumb I've found is if you take the cents per kWh that you pay for electricity and multiply it by 8.5, that gets you the equivalent cost of gasoline. Just use 10. Multiply by 10, the numbers will still work in your favor. You get some crazy low gasoline prices and it's just a lot easier to do. So 12.5 cents per kWh, roughly an average residential charging rate is equivalent to $1.25 a gallon. And if you tell anybody you can get them gasoline for $1.25 a gallon, people will turn around on the highway, come back, figure out what's going on. It makes the news if a gas station accidentally prices their gas that low. And people don't realize they get that energy that cheaply already at home. They just have to use an EV. That stat comes from the EPA. If you've heard of the EPA e-gallon, you can dive into exactly how it's derived. But it's basically taking the energy content of electricity and gasoline, putting them into equivalent terms, and then comparing the prices. A couple of the other benefits beyond just electricity is cheaper that people tend not to think about. With electricity, you can lock in your rate for a long time. And so you can say, not only are you getting your fuel for the equivalent of $1.25 a gallon, but you can lock that rate in for up to 5 years. If gasoline prices go up, doesn't affect you. If electricity prices go up, doesn't affect you. You've locked in a rate that low, which I know people would love to be able to do for gasoline if they had the opportunity. The other half of my job is solar. So you can sign a contract with a retail electric provider in Texas for up to 5 years. If you get solar panels on your house, you're actually doing something similar. You're locking in an electricity rate, specifically an energy charge, for as long as 30 years, which is the warranty period on most solar systems. Two quick plugs for Green Mountain here because we offer the solar panels. One of them is we actually offer free level 2 chargers if you put in solar panels with us and size it for the usage of a future EV. And we'll get into this a little later in charging, but when you're already going in and kind of rewiring the house, opening up the electrical panel, doing all of that work, putting in a level 2 charger is relatively easy. There's really no additional labor cost. It's just the cost of the unit. Whereas doing it as a one-off project makes it a little more complicated. Finally, a third perspective on cheaper is when I had my 2012 Leaf, I was able to drive, it was an average amount, we drove about 10,000 miles a year on $20 a month in electricity. And I don't know hardly anybody who can get through a month of driving on $20 in gas, and certainly not doing something like $1,000 a month. I'm sorry, 1,000 miles a month. Continuing to go through, we've talked about kind of the operating costs. There's two other things that people think about. The sticker price of an EV. You often see EVs are much more expensive. How am I going to afford that car? The crazy thing to me is not that EVs are so expensive, but that gas cars are so expensive. The average price of a new car, I think this comes from either KBB or Edmunds, one of those guys puts it out, is $45,000. Part of that is pandemic related, but the fact that the average new car is 45 grand, A, to me is just crazy. And B, shows people are buying expensive cars. Why is a $45,000 EV any different than a $45,000 gas car? So this chart over here, I know it's impossible to read because there's too many EV models on it, which I love because there's more than just the two that were out there when I started. Shows just in yellow the range of each of these cars, and then the blue bars are the prices, with the red line being the average price of a new gas car. And the key point here is there are a number of EVs that are available on the market for prices less than the average new gas car. And they don't have 20-mile ranges. They don't only go 40 miles an hour. They're completely viable, relatively long-range cars, which has a lot to do with the fact that batteries have gotten so much cheaper over the last decade. Finally, people tend not to think about this. People tend to look at sticker price and not consider total cost of ownership. But looking at the total cost of ownership, when you combine sticker price, fuel cost, maintenance cost, I'll get into PHEVs in just a second, the total cost of ownership of an EV is lower. And it's almost hard to get that, or hard to realize just how much better an EV can be until you're driving one and you realize you're not going to the gas station and you're not paying for it anymore. So that's something that is good to think about, but tends not to come up as a selling point. The reason I have PHEVs versus BEVs in there is twofold, and we'll get into it a little more later. One is PHEVs have a little more maintenance requirement. They've got that gas engine still in there. And the other one is, I don't remember. The maintenance requirement is the big one. There's also some gas cost in there. The other one is single car families. So if you only have one car in your fleet, a PHEV makes a lot more sense. And I didn't want to leave them out. Continuing down cheaper, this is another reason for the rise in average prices, primarily of gas cars. People want trucks and SUVs. Those vehicles are more expensive. They're bigger. It struck me, this is a chart from the National Auto Dealers Association, just how many trucks and SUVs people are buying. I started in the industry 2011. It had just crested 50%, stayed there for about 5 years. And as of last year, 75% of the new models in the country are trucks and SUVs. So to me, that says as soon as more electric trucks and SUVs come out, that'll do great things for EVs. I'm excited to see them coming out over the next couple of years. And we'll get into the F-150 specifically with its power output capability. And I think it's on the slide where we talk about future technologies. So a whole bunch of stuff on cheaper. Couple of rules of thumb for how to think about how much cheaper an EV is, how expensive electricity is, that sort of thing. Moving into the next topic of cleaner. The idea here is EVs pollute less. There's generally actually fairly little resistance that I run into on this point. People are usually saying, yeah, I get it, they're cleaner. But there's a couple ways to go beyond that. One is some people just don't care. And that frustrates me, but I'd rather get them into an EV for a reason that they want to be in it rather than argue with them about carbon dioxide and whether it's a problem. There's so many other benefits that I don't feel the need to harp on the fact that they're cleaner, harp on the fact that they're better for the environment. And as I have on the slide, Tesla proved that people want to buy fun, high performance cars. And you see a lot of people that say, it's a great car. It's just a better car. It does everything I want it to do better. Why would I go with gasoline? And finding out what resonates with people specifically without asking them to change their lifestyle. There's always an angle you can take. There's always a piece of data you can find that will make people think about it a little more. CO2, depends on my audience. If I know it's an audience that cares about CO2, that understands CO2, I talk about it a lot. If I'm talking to someone who's less likely to be predisposed to an EV, I'll try to focus on local air quality, all of the emissions that come out of a tailpipe. Let me see if I've got something on the next slide I wanted to cover. Okay, good, we'll cover it there. All these other emissions, SOx, NOx, volatile organic compounds, particulate matter, and carbon monoxide, that's the stuff you're breathing in behind a car or a truck that smells bad. It's much less divisive. Everybody likes their local air to be clean. Everybody wants air to be clean for their kids. And the good news is gas cars have cleaned that up a lot over the last, probably 50 or 60 years. But it's still a good thing to focus on and kind of get people more predisposed to wanting to look into an EV and maybe drive one themselves. A couple of myths around cleaner, a couple of talking points and factoids around that. One is the long tailpipe myth, the idea that you're just taking the tailpipe of an electric car and transferring it to the power plant. There's a couple of answers to that. One is almost any power plant is going to be more efficient in terms of the amount of energy they extract from the fuel and the little amount of pollution that they put into the air per unit of energy they extract, for a couple of reasons. One is they can run, whoever's running the power plant can run it at its most efficient output level, or at the very least running it at scale. There's a lot of heat losses in a gasoline or a diesel engine just because it is so small. And so many power plants, even fossil fuel ones, are at their heart heat engines. One of the ones I always like to think about is a power plant has to be more efficient than the V8 engine in your car or in your truck, because if it wasn't, a power plant would just be a giant field of V8s kind of running all the time. Because they're built differently, there must be something about them that makes them cleaner, more efficient, more profitable to build at scale, which is very much true. Building small heat engines is just less efficient. You lose a lot of that heat. Finally, sometimes I'll just take that argument and say, let's assume it's true. Let's assume that you're plugged essentially directly into a coal power plant and the emissions are equal. Even then, there's benefits. If you're charging at night, the emissions both move out of where people are driving and walking and living. They tend to move out of, power plants tend to be located in outlying areas, at least in Texas. Again, I know it changes across the country. So you can move those emissions away from where people are and where they're breathing them in terms of the local air pollution. Obviously, CO2 is global, so the time and the place for CO2 matters less. And the time actually helps as well. It's not being put, again, into the air when and where people are. So even assuming that the argument is accurate, there's still benefits. A couple of factoids: if you charge using grid power in Texas, even just not assuming 100% green plan or anything, looking at the carbon intensity of the grid, there is a 65 to 70% reduction in the pollution that you're putting out by driving an EV. And that's broadly accurate across both CO2 and those local air pollution. Obviously, if you have 100% renewable power, GME only sells 100% renewable power, you get 100% reduction in that pollution. And happy to talk through how that works, what that means, how we make sure it's 100% renewable as we get further along. Finally, as I was researching this, I noticed that diesels aren't subject to emissions testing in Texas. I found that odd. If anybody has further detail on that, I'd love to learn more. I didn't mean to put something out that I didn't know a whole lot about, but it was certainly important enough that it was worth bringing up for me. And then finally on this slide, there's a map that the Union of Concerned Scientists put out that essentially helps get people's head around what it means to drive electric and be clean. And what this says is if you use the average grid mix, the average mix of coal, gas, nuclear, renewables, all the different electricity generating sources, how many miles per gallon would your gas car have to get in order to be as clean as that mix? It may be a little hard to read here, but even the dirtiest states are at or above the level of most cars. The dark blue ones you can see here are kind of in the 40 miles per gallon. Texas is up close to 70. So it's just a third-party source that really dug into the data and said the long tailpipe myth is exactly that. It is a myth. Electricity is cleaner. And depending on your economic views, you can tell it's cleaner because it's cheaper, which kind of means it's more efficient. So just a more efficient way of delivering energy. One big one here, people think about their gas car emitting emissions. They know it does. They kind of sense it. For me, we'll get to this in a second. It's one of the things I feel bad about having a gas car, but people don't realize that their house actually emits more than their car does. Maybe in here, I think it's gonna be a little later. What is a kWh? People use electricity at their house and they say, okay, I'm using 2000 kWh a month, but nobody really has any concept of how much energy that is. Short answer is it's a lot. It's more than you think. But getting people, if you want to address emissions, there is actually something out there that's easier than getting people to convert to an EV, which is getting them to switch their electricity supply. And then instead of having to change their lifestyle, they just click a button and their electricity becomes green. So just a way of thinking about addressing the biggest sources of emissions first. Finally, I know a lot of my coworkers think that for me, EVs are always the answer. They usually are. Kind of doesn't really matter what the question is at work. And there's a couple of places that electric would be cleaner, but I just don't see it being viable yet. First one is aviation. Second one is long haul trucking. Both of those are very weight sensitive environments and batteries don't have the energy density quite yet to be able to handle that. I put, instead of 1 and 2, 1 and 1.5, because I think long haul trucking may be able to overcome it, certainly before aviation. Curious to see how the Tesla Semi and all those other large trucks do. And the good news is there are carbon offsets, at least to handle the carbon pollution associated with the CO2 emissions of those industries. So addressing just the cleaner portion until technologies evolve to be able to store electricity much more densely. And if I remember right, I was working through this last night, I want to say energy density would have to go up something like 100-fold before batteries just have the same amount of energy and the same amount of weight that gasoline does. Gasoline is fantastically energy dense, and you can translate that across generally all of the petroleum fuels. Finally, something I was thinking about that I actually don't know much about. I don't know if there are similar offsets to carbon offsets for other pollutants. I don't know if the idea of a SOx or a NOx offset makes any sense, but if anybody's ever heard of anything like that, I'd love to learn more about. Finally, one of my favorites, third one of my favorites, I think it goes into fourth here. EVs end up being actually more convenient than gas cars. And this is something people don't expect. They expect it's going to be less convenient. They expect they're going to spend a lot of time recharging, a lot of time thinking about how much range they have, a lot of time figuring out where to charge. And that ends up being really sort of a one-time cost as people make the transition from gas to EVs. Once they have them, they're in the habit, it's easier, and they realize they're actually worrying about fewer things. They just had to learn them and figure out how to work with them. So the first one is range anxiety. It takes two forms, both of which are, I'm going to get stranded. People are worried they're either going to get stranded on the road with no public charging station, or they're going to get stranded at home with a battery that's nearly dead, a cord that's dripping miles into it, and they won't be able to go where they want. The funny thing about this is it exists with gas cars too. I get gas range anxiety. I watch the needle on the gas tank fall down. The light comes on. I'm thinking about, okay, I got to go get gas, but I have to go make a special trip to get gas, or I have to work it into a trip that I'm already doing. Whereas with EVs, you plug it in at home and you forget about it. I'm going to drop down to the amount of time spent recharging real quick. The typical treatment in an article is a 60 kWh battery charging at, it's called 6 kW, even using a fast level 2 charger that's available at a house is going to take 10 hours recharging. People who haven't driven EVs tend to think, I can fill up my gas car in 5 minutes. I don't want to stand around for 10 hours driving an EV. And getting them to realize that the car charges while you do other things is something that even I didn't realize until I drove a long range EV with a level 2 charger. To give you some background on me, my first EV was a 2012 Nissan Leaf. It went 75 miles if I was lucky. I used a level 1 charger on it. And when I drove I think it was a 2020 Leaf with a level 2 charger, I was literally saying, where's the excitement? Where's the danger? It's too easy. It's so easy that there's literally no worry anymore. I don't have to plug it in every time I come home, that sort of thing. Little factoid number to use, which is people worry about not having enough time to charge their car. Your average car is only on the road about 5% of the time. The rest of the time it's parked. Even non-pandemic, you've got at least 12 hours at home, somewhere around there, to charge it up. You can get a full charge every day. And one of the things is you don't need a full charge every day. You can just plug it in whenever, and the times that you're not driving anywhere, it fills up more, and you've basically always got a full tank. One of my early coworkers once said, imagine you woke up every day with magically a half a tank of gas in your car. How often would you go to the gas station? Most people say, not really all that much unless they're commuting, massive amounts. So a couple ways to think about it there. I'd mentioned the habit of getting into an EV. I've seen studies, it takes 3 to 6 months to get used to it. My anecdotal evidence of when I switched over, same thing. The first day you're thinking about, how much range do I have? Where can I charge? Am I going to get stranded? What's going on? What's the data? Let me look at the app. And you look at it less and less every day until you just get in the car and drive, and then come home and plug it in and forget about it and go about the rest of your life. And that's when you become fully indoctrinated. I'd love to run a study where I give people an EV for 3 to 6 months and see how many of them return it early. It's always a good point to flip the paradigm and say, okay, I'm not going to try to get you to convert to an EV. I'm going to give you one and see if you want to give it up. And people tend to be a lot more receptive then. No, I'm not currently able to give you an EV for 3 to 6 months. But if I ever am, I will certainly let Evolve Houston know about it. People have said that sounds like you're trying to get people hooked. That is exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to give them a taste of what it's like, get them to realize that it's better, and then get them to convert over. See if I can speed up a little bit. Key points here. Charging is hard to set up. Even in a house, it's another factor that you haven't had to think about every time you bought a car. The offsetting benefit of that is it's easier to use once it's set up. Let's see, I don't think I can cover it here anyway. Apartments are hard. You've got, in addition to the driver, the automaker, the car dealer, and family, all of that, you've got the apartment, and you have to put in a charger and figure out a business model for that. That's not something that's been completed yet. That's not something that's sort of widespread in Texas. I want to say California has now mandated new construction has to pre-wire for an L2 charger or a certain number of L2 chargers. I don't know the details off the top of my head. Apartments are hard, but the benefit for me is there is so much runway, there's so much opportunity with people who live in single family homes with garages that's the market I'm going to focus on. I can talk to them. I can get the people who it's easiest to do for and see if I can get them before I start worrying about that harder. I don't want to call it an edge case because something like half of people live in apartments. But I do want to focus on people that can make the transition pretty easily. Another plug for GME. We do offer a free L2 charger. If you buy panels from us and size your system, it ends up being about 120% offset or 100% offset plus 6 extra panels. So just a way to marry EVs and solar together. Another note on one of our product offerings, if you buy the panels from us, we do have true net metering available, along with an app that kind of matches the currently it matches your Tesla to a specific time of use plan that we have. So a couple of things that we're working on there. Getting back to the main point of you see these articles that kind of tend to say the same thing. EVs are advancing so rapidly that it's difficult for people to keep up with the advances in their capabilities. I've seen a lot of people who say, that EV can only go 75 miles. It can't charge very quickly. The battery degrades. It can't take the heat. And if it's hard for me to keep up with those advances over the last 5, 6, 7 years, really, I can totally understand why it's harder for someone who doesn't do this as their job every day. Key points here are costs continue to fall relatively rapidly. Range and capabilities continue to increase largely because of those falling costs. Both of those contribute to EVs gaining more and more scale, at which point they can be built on an industrial scale. Costs continue to come down. Adoptability continues to go up. I think we talked a little bit about this. Electrify what's easy to electrify: single family homes with garages and large breaker boxes, lots of capacity. Plenty of opportunity with multi-car family, multi-car garage, single family homes. Worrying about apartments once that's complete, and really giving people what they want. I know I often fall victim to saying things like, you don't need a level 2 charger, you can use level 1. You don't need to drive 150 miles a day or 300 miles a day. If they want it, give it to them. Automakers have been good, I think, about responding to that as battery costs have come down and they've been able to shove more batteries into cars. More fun. I love this one. People tend to equate EVs to hybrids, but there's a big difference. Yes, they both get better mileage than your traditional gas car, but EVs traded off a fun driving experience for that better mileage. Hybrids traded off that driving experience for better mileage, whereas EVs give you the best of both worlds. They're quieter, they're zippier, they're torquier. You don't have to give up that driving experience in order to get better mileage or really lower cost of transportation. People tend not to think about just how much quieter they are. If you live next to a freeway, currently you're not going to notice the difference. I know the first time I lived next to one, I was absolutely blown away how loud they are. There's some stats out there, I can't remember off the top of my head, something like half the noise of a car driving at freeway speeds comes from the engine. A lot of it comes from wind, a lot of it comes from tires. But stand by the side of a road, listen to an EV drive by. It makes for a much nicer environment to live in. And if you're talking to anybody that's at the policy level, quieter living areas make for higher value land, raises the value of everything out there. I'd love to do a study on exactly how much. Don't quite know how to do that, but an interesting point there. Talked about zippier, all the torque available all the time. You can kind of zip out in front of stoplights. I had, again, a 2012 Leaf, not exactly a supercar, but because you could punch it so quickly, you could hop out in front of nearly everything. Last one on this is oftentimes, trying to remember how this works, if you're in the back seat of a car, you can't hear what the people in the front are saying. That goes away with an EV just because it is so much quieter inside. I'm going to speed up since nobody has told me that I'm going too fast or too slow. Still got some to go through. Combining all of the above, I think we'd said already, hybrids trade off, driving experience for better mileage. EVs give you the best of both worlds. My personal experience, I want an EV so I can feel less guilty about driving and less guilty about my lifestyle. It's a combination of I'm cheap, I like saving money. I feel bad putting pollution into the atmosphere. And I feel bad putting a burden on other people, both in terms of noise and pollution. So it's literally with an EV, I can assuage that guilt. I don't feel bad taking a trip. I feel that it's just less imposition on other people and on the environment. All right, so those were the main points. Now we get into the second half. I think I can go through these fairly quickly, and we should leave. It'll be at least 15 minutes for questions at the end. Here's one of my favorites. What is a kWh? I'd mentioned a house may use 2,000 kWh over the course of a month. A kWh is the unit of electricity, which doesn't really help anybody. People often define it as the energy to run 10 100-watt light bulbs for an hour. Again, doesn't really help people relate to it. A definition that I came across that I really like is if you spend 8 hours a day doing manual labor, shoveling dirt into a wheelbarrow, lifting rocks, whatever it happens to be, you would have put out 1/2 of 1 kWh over the course of that day. Looking at it another way, 1 full day of manual labor could be replaced by 5 cents worth of electricity. Putting that into context, electricity as an energy source is very, very cheap. And electricity is much more powerful than people expect. To power an air conditioner, you need 40 people pedaling on those little bicycle generators for 12 hours a day. Electricity provides that. And whatever your electric bill is for the month, I don't think you could pay any less than that by paying people to pedal bikes. There's been a couple of gyms that have put them on their bikes and kind of put energy back into the building. And the crazy thing is that they're essentially toys, no matter how much they're used. It's just electricity has got a lot of power into it. A kWh is a lot of electricity. And the fact that you can get one for 10, 12, even 15 cents is pretty unbelievable. Comparing gasoline to batteries, I'm not going to go fully into this because I could just keep getting more and more into it. We talked a little bit about the energy density. I was close on the 100x energy density thing. People talk about the weight of the cars. PHEVs certainly tend to be heavier than their gas car counterparts because they've got a several 100-pound gasoline engine along with a several 100-pound battery. Yes, gasoline is 6 pounds per gallon. A battery is the equivalent of 150 pounds per gallon. That's actually 450, but you can use 3 times the energy. So you divide by 3 and get to 150. And a lot of this just goes back to me to say, people complain about EVs being too heavy. And my answer is, if you're worried about weight, drive a smaller car. Weight of a vehicle is clearly not something we're too worried about when 75% of the vehicles that we buy are light trucks. I just don't believe that everybody needs a light truck, but that's an argument that I've clearly been losing. Big question that I get a lot and really had to research fairly recently is, won't we need a lot of electricity to power those EVs? Where's that going to come from? Is it going to crash the grid? What's the deal there? One of my answers is the grid is very well controlled. The people who are in charge of, going back to February, you might have a different view on that. But the people who are in charge of making sure that the grid is planned out and stays balanced do a pretty good job at it, because otherwise the whole thing goes down and everybody gets mad. But a better answer is, we already have that electricity. We already are embedding that electricity into gasoline. Each gallon of gasoline that gets pumped into your tank, if you go back along its supply chain, has about 6 kWh of electricity embedded in it. And that's a combination of how the energy it takes to explore, drill, transport, refine, pump. It's an estimate. You could argue with me on exactly what the number is, but there is a long supply chain behind it. So you could take those 6 kWh, make your gallon of gasoline, use the gasoline to drive yourself about 25 miles, or you could use those same 6 kWh to drive yourself 25 miles directly on gasoline at, it's not 100% efficiency, but it's close. Key takeaway is we don't need more electricity to power EVs. We just need to redirect it away from producing gasoline. And that will get, that will tend to solve the problem of, do we need more electricity to power the EVs? No, as long as it's taking gasoline out of the grid, you've got the electricity available. There are some issues with, okay, instead of going to a refinery, it's going to a residential area. There is grid investment that's needed, but it's not a fundamental problem. It's a redirection problem. I think I've got just 2 or 3 more here. Everything about an EV is backwards. Seems like everything people say to me about it is like, no, it's actually backwards. People are worried about finding a fast charger in their city. You don't need fast chargers in your city. You need them on the highway well away from your city because you can get 200 miles before you need one. You need charging where you park most often, not where you drive most often. City efficiency is better than highway efficiency. People think you need a larger, faster charger if you have a larger battery. And I'm also kind of a lone crusader here in promoting level 1 charging. I like level 1 charging because it's an easier setup, and people with garages, again, in Texas, in Houston, tend to have level 1 power available. So it's a good way to kind of get into the EV habit. But people tend to want level 2 charging largely because they're worried, I'm going to need it. I mean, I can't wait 40 hours for this car to charge, and they haven't figured out yet. It charges while you're parking. You don't need it to be 100% every time you leave. As long as you have the mileage you need when you leave the house, you're good. That said, I don't want to stand in the way of anybody getting a level 2 charger. If they want one, we're happy to put it in place. We're happy to help them figure out a way to get it. But there's a couple tables that I came up with down here that say across the top for your efficiency, think of this as miles per gallon. 3 miles per kWh is the efficiency that a large Tesla gets. 4 is about the efficiency that a small Tesla gets. Everything else is in this range. If you're driving less than this number of miles per day on average, you will never wake up with less than a full battery in your car. A level 1 charger can put this many miles into your car before you have to even worry about it not being full in the morning, assuming you can charge 8, 10, 12, 14 hours a day. So a couple of takeaways from this. One is level 1 may be more capable than you think. Obviously, I lived with level 1 for years. I think I had that car for 5 years, and it worked out fine. We were driving normal amounts, but we were running the battery down very low every day. If you quadruple the charging speed, all of a sudden EVs look like a no-brainer. You would have to drive 200-300 miles a day before not being able to fully charge the car every day. And I know I'm running out of time, so it's going to be hard to go into all of that. But you don't need a full charge every day. You only need to be able to get where you're going and back home. EV subsidies, people like to talk about. EVs are getting all of these tax breaks. They're getting all of these rebates. 2020, the U.S. government spent about $2 billion on EV subsidies. There's 2 other major ones that go to oil and gas. It's a good study by, I think it's the Environmental Law Institute. Between 2002 and 2008, the government spent $10 billion a year on oil and gas subsidies. That's a combination of tax breaks and direct spending, in addition to, depending how you calculate it, a 25 to 75 cent per gallon subsidy provided by the military defending the free flow of oil. So if anybody says, we should level the playing field, I always say, I'd be happy to. Let's get rid of all of them, and we'll see which one wins out. Future is here today. So we've got technologies that I'm not going to get into. I'd rather answer your questions about these. We talked a little bit about the EV app. Time of use charging is really inside of that app, connecting an EV to charge the car when it's most efficient, when it's most cost effective. Demand response is starting to come out. The second level of demand response is vehicle to grid, taking electricity out of the car, pushing it back to the grid. And the F-150 Lightning is going to be a really cool one for that because it can put 10 kW out, which is a real amount of power. I talked a little bit about a typical day at work for me, which is the answer is EVs. That tends to come before the question. Sometimes also solar. Doesn't really matter what the question is. That tends to be my answer. So I know my coworkers make fun of me for that, but I'm okay with that because this is the thing that I really want to make happen. This is the thing that I'm evangelical about. That I know the right answer and I want to get it out there and convert other people. A little bit about GME and what I do there. I'm glad to work there. Partially because I get to influence electricity product development with all of this stuff that I've learned over the last 10 years. So I'm excited for both what's going on in the industry as well as for things that we'll be releasing over the next couple of years that you should keep an eye out for. So as usual, I went over the time that I said I would do, but I think we've got about 15 minutes left, and you've got my email address here if we end up not getting to your question and you wanted to reach out to me.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for the presentation. Let's just jump into the questions
Sure.
real quick. So the first question is, how much can the battery degrade in an EV, and how fast or slow does that occur? And is it worth switching to EVs with their current battery technology?
Yes, excellent question. Something I hadn't addressed in here. So a couple of ways to answer this. The first one is that every EV battery in the US has to have a minimum warranty of 8 years and 100,000 miles. That warranty covers really against total failure. So the automaker will replace it. And it's funny, as long as I've been working in the industry, there's only, I remember right, something like 60,000 cars maybe out of several million on the road now that have exceeded that time frame. In addition to that, there are usually automaker warranties about how much of that capacity it will hold, which I think is what you're referring to as degradation. They've gotten a lot better over the last 10 years. Some of the early Leaf batteries really didn't do well in the heat. One of the things that's happened is almost all of the batteries, I think, are liquid cooled now, which has really helped reduce that degradation. I want to give an answer to you in terms of percent degradation per year. I don't know it exactly, but you could be safe with something like 0.5% per year of capacity reduction. It's not something that's overly noticeable in most of the cars that are on the road now. Hopefully that answers that.
Next is from Maria. What is the role of legislation to change the pace of the adoption of EVs? Focusing specifically on Texas, could it be the only way to accelerate the change?
Could it be the only way to accelerate the change? There we go. So I definitely think this gets back into that subsidies slide. The first one is, I think there is a lot of subsidy out there. There is a lot of legislative support for what's becoming old technology. And a lot of that, from what I gather, was put in place in the 1920s when oil was the future. Oil was more flexible, more powerful, cleaner than coal. It did need to be developed. It has powered a lot of wealth development. We're now coming to the end of that. And for some reason, all of the subsidies and supports are still in place for oil. So I think that largely gets back to leveling the playing field and saying, I'd love to have that same support for a technology that is providing the same benefit to society now that oil and gas were 100 years ago. So I think I'd answer that by saying, yes, legislation helps. The cool part is, even absent legislation, even absent, direct support, specifically thinking in Texas for EVs, we don't have an EV incentive anymore. The technology is still being adopted, and it's still getting better, and it's still going to win out anyway. despite not having as much support. Hopefully that answers that.
Accessibility of maintenance for an EV to be as accessible as gas cars?
Cost, I think I'd put both of those and say they're probably better now. There's one, so I'm going to answer this in a couple of different sections. Cost of maintenance for an EV is certainly lower than gas. There's almost nothing that needs to be done to it. Certainly with any new car, the 8-year, 100,000-mile warranty covers that length of time for really any powertrain issues. The number of issues with a battery and a motor is going to be so much lower than with a gasoline car, just because there's so many fewer moving parts, and it's under much less stress. A gas engine works by constantly exploding gasoline and then trying to contain that explosion. And then you've got a whole bunch of emissions equipment around it and just so much stuff that can break. An electric car is a giant battery driving a motor that's essentially a bar with a coil of wire around it spinning. No reciprocating motion. It's all cyclical, much less stress. So that tends to do it on the maintenance side. The rest of the car is about equal to a gas car. Unsurprisingly, automakers wanted to use the same brakes, the same doors, the same electronics. It's funny, you've got this giant battery and an EV still has a 12-volt battery in it and a 12-volt electrical system, just like every other car, because they're using a lot of the same components. I want to say there's been some talk of moving that up to 48 volts, slightly more efficiency, more powerful, a couple of things like that. But the rest of the car really is parts out of the parts bin from the automaker that they've been using forever. The one thing to note is brakes tend to last longer because you've got regenerative braking. So a lot of the energy of the car moving forward in order to get it to stop, instead of getting turned into heat through the brakes, I want to say on average about 10% of that gets turned back into electricity to put back into the battery. So maintenance and costs, certainly the operating costs of it are already winning out over gasoline cars.
Perfect. Next one is, are there any specific technologies that you find most promising to improve battery density, especially bringing EV to heavy duty?
Specific technologies, this is an area that I'm not overly strong in. Bringing EV to heavy duty, certainly the more we can condense it, the better. I think the one that excites me the most, and it may just be because it has the coolest name, is supercapacitors. I don't know a whole lot about them. Love to see if they came out. There's another factoid, which has been EV battery technology. This was true about 10 years ago. EV battery technology improved at the rate of about 7 to 8% per year. And that would be 1 year, it would get a little more energy dense. Next year, it would get a little bit cheaper. The next year, it would get a little more power dense. And you have these 8 or 9 different things you're trying to improve. And each of them would improve a little bit or take a jump. And on average, it ended up being about a 7 or 8% improvement. I should be able to do 7 or 8% improvement. How long does it take us to get to a 100-fold, a 10,000% improvement in energy density? I don't know if that's going to stick with lithium-ion technology or if it's going to be some radical, something like a supercapacitor that's completely different or something entirely out there. I know if you look, you can find articles that say, I've got this battery that's 10x better than anything that's been on the market. If you can build one, I'll buy it. Someone will buy it. So something will come out. Something will get there. I just don't know exactly what it is. So supercapacitors.
Compared the level 1 and level 2 chargers. We have a question. Is level 1 charging viable when supplemented with public level 2 charging and as well as the DCFC charging when needed?
I like that one. It's level 1 charging is certainly viable at home. We talked about how far you can drive on it. I would say you'd be much more likely to supplement level 1 charging at home with DC charging when needed, as opposed to public level 2. People kind of plug into, people would drive with me and they say, why don't you plug into that charger, that level 2 charger in front of the Whole Foods? I said, we're going to be here 20 minutes. I'll get 12 miles. It's not worth it. Public level 2 charging is not fast enough to be fast, but far away enough from home to be inconvenient. I know charging networks would disagree with me, but they can absolutely do so. But public level 2 charging to me is not the thing that, well, public level 2 charging may get people to convert to EVs, but if they try to rely on that, I think they're going to be disappointed. Level 1 charging plus DC fast charging in public, especially when you have a large battery that can take that full fast charge rate the whole way. Once you get up to about 80% state of charge, the fast charger starts to charge slower and slower. Think of packing people into a movie theater. The first people can sit wherever they want. Next ones are trying to pick their way over and try to, you can't, it doesn't fill like a gasoline tank where you can fill it at a full rate all the way up. It's diffusing through a solid matrix. So anyway, that's getting too deep. And I think the answer is level 1 plus DC fast charging is certainly a good way to go. Looks like we lost, there we go.
Yes, next one is, I know you kind of answered in terms of EV battery life, but the question is, what is the life of battery, i.e. the lifetime, and can EV batteries be recycled?
Yes, so a couple of ways to recycle it. The life of an EV battery, as I said, minimum 8 years, 100,000 miles. They tend to still have life after that. And there is, in short, a huge energy storage market having to do with all sorts of stuff. Energy arbitrage is the big one. If you've heard of the duck curve, it's the fact that energy demand over the course of the day fluctuates lower at night, higher in the afternoon for Texas, at least in the summer. Any way to flatten that out means we are making better use of our infrastructure. You've got power plants that are running all the time instead of part of the time, which is both easier on them. You get more money out of them for the investment you put in. It's also easier on them in terms of maintenance. Again, they're largely heating up, cooling down is hard on materials. And there was something with at the end of a battery's life, there's certainly someone who will want to buy it from you.
I see quite a bit of questions with the cost of chargers. There are quite a bit of questions. If you can kind of specify what's the on average cost to install level 2 chargers at home, if you have any estimates of that.
Call it $1,000. The charger is several $100, $400 or $500. The install ranges from $500 to $1,000. So you're looking at $1,000, $1,500, something like that. Yes, it's an additional cost. On the other hand, people spend that on something that goes into the car at the dealer that may be much less useful. So it's people get to make their own decisions about it. But call it $1,000, $1,500, somewhere around there, depending on your setup.
IRS itself, or as well as the companies that install your chargers that provide those rebates, so it kind of offsets your costs quite a bit. And I know Evolve Houston is working to help out people who have installed level 2 chargers to help them to get the best possible rebate, as well as the highest money back just from installing those chargers. So just something to keep in mind. We have time for just one last question, unfortunately. Can you discuss just a little bit about the hydrogen fuel cell vehicles and how do they compare to EVs?
Sure. And I think I can cover this in about a minute. Actually, Saad, if you want to save these questions, I'm happy to kind of go through them in more depth afterwards. So the real advantage of hydrogen over EV is the faster recharge time. You can fill it up. I don't know exactly how long it takes to fill up a hydrogen car, but you can do a full recharge in more of that gas station style, 5, 10, 15 minutes, something like that. But the downsides is it's a lot less efficient and there's no infrastructure set up for it. People often tell me, they say, I'd love to buy an EV, but there's no electric infrastructure set up. But I'm saying, look around you. There's power everywhere. The electric infrastructure of the country, certainly the country, I'd say the world. I know there's a lot of places that don't have electricity, is among the largest, most impactful infrastructure projects we've ever taken on. It's all over the place. The other one is in efficiency of the fuel. Hydrogen really comes from two places. It's either you electrolyze water, run an electric current through water, you get oxygen on one side, hydrogen on the other. Can't remember which one goes positive, which one goes negative. Why not take that electricity and drive the car directly? The other source of hydrogen is steam reformation of natural gas. Take natural gas, combine it with steam, chemical reaction, hydrogen comes out. Again, it's more efficient to take the natural gas, burn it for electricity, and use the electricity to drive the car directly rather than to create the hydrogen and try to store it. So nothing against hydrogen. I think the adoption of fast charging specifically has just kind of killed one of its advantages.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we kind of have to come to an end with the Q&As. I will make sure to take down all the questions and reach out to you, and we'll try to get them answered and put them with our webinar recordings. If you guys have any specific questions, I saw some questions that were specifically towards Green Mountain Energy. Feel free to reach out to Daniel. He'll be happy to answer those. Again, thank you, Daniel, for your time. Before I close out, I would like to thank Evolve Houston for sponsoring these events. And lastly, I would like to thank the audience members. You guys have been joining every month. So without you guys, these wouldn't be possible. And it kind of shows with the amount of people attending, there is quite a bit of interest in EVs, and it just keeps growing. Keep an eye out for our next webinar. The details of those will be going out soon. As we finalize those, we have a great presentation, hopefully on consumer surveys results that we have planned. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.